Welcome to our debate this evening on whether we should use identity first language or person first language. The members of this debate include Grant Morgan, Tatum Capouch, Margaret Florence, and Alex O'Keefe. Grant and Tatum will argue in favor of person first language. Myself and Alex will argue in favor of identity first language. So there's an ongoing argument on whether the use of either person first language or the use of identity first language to describe individuals is ethical. It is important how we address others and how individuals address themselves due to the many implications and impacts language can have on others. According to Botha highlights that autistic people are at an increased risk for self-harm, PTSD, suicidal ideations, and death by suicide. In this debate, both sides will discuss the importance and the implications of using person-first language and identity-first language when addressing individuals with a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So the rules of the debate. The time frame of the debate will be between 30 and 45 minutes. Each team will get 3 minutes for opening statements. After opening statements, we will move on to specific debate topics. There will be 7 minutes to discuss each point. After each side provides evidence to support their topics, we will move into closing statements. Each side will be granted 5 minutes for their closing statement. The audience will then ask questions. Members will have 2 minutes to respond to each question. Let's begin. The floor is yours, Grant.
Thank you, Margaret, for your opening statement. As Tatum and I begin arguing for person-first language, I think it's important to acknowledge that person-first language is the preference of people on the spectrum. We should be responsive to the people we are working with, and I want to be clear that there is no one-size-fits-all here, but if someone on the spectrum's preferences for language are unknown, we should use person-first language as the default. Since we all live and work in the US, we should use the majority opinion of Americans on the spectrum as the default. As far as the description of the issue is concerned, the issue here is whether to use person-first language, such as person with autism or person on the spectrum, or identity-first language, such as autistic person or autistic, when addressing someone. Language shapes our understanding of autism and can have risks, such as the ones Margaret outlined, including bad things such as self-harm, PTSD, suicidal ideations, and death, unfortunately. And despite the joys and accomplishments that many people on the spectrum bring, it is, according to the DSM-5, it is still a disability. And part of the issue with identity-first language is that the disability shouldn't be the focus of the identity. We can show dignity for people by acknowledging their personhood before acknowledging their deficits.
Yeah, so essentially what Grant is saying is that we should address people using person first language, so saying a person with autism rather than an autistic person, as they are more than their diagnosis. We want to protect and speak up for the autism community to honor their human rights as well as to protect them from any harm socially, psychologically, and physically.
Thank you, Margaret, for your opening statement and your introduction, and thank you, Grant and Tatum, for your opening statements. This topic has been an ongoing topic of discussion. It's not just important to address the topic for the sake of using correct language, but we want to also keep in mind the welfare of those individuals who we are talking about. How we address people, specifically autistic people, can have an impact on their lives and increase the likelihood of harmful risks to them. The risks that Margaret talked about at the beginning of this debate are very serious and can have a lasting effect on the lives of these individuals and their future. Can something as simple as changing our terminology be useful in minimizing these risks? Me and Margaret will argue that using for identity first language, we do think so. Today, we're going to address the topic of what terminology we should be using when we talk about autistic people. This topic is ever changing, and as research continues, our knowledge also expands. For some time, people first language was the default language. However, the shift to identity first language has started to emerge and become more desired. So, what do we do? Should we be using person first language or identity first language? Throughout this debate, we're going to discuss a variety of key points relating to what language we should be using. Margaret and I believe that we should be using identity first language when addressing autistic people because their diagnosis is a part of who they are and their identity. By doing this, we move towards inclusion and support for autistic people.
Tatum and I argue that it is derogatory to refer to someone by their diagnosis. Historically, this type of language has been used to reflect people as pitiful or inferior, and it should also be acknowledged that the NIH, the primary governing body of health in the United States, has advocated for using person-first language when personal preference is unknown. Identity first language was not historically used to reflect the preferences of people on the spectrum, but rather reflected the medical terminology.
Okay, Alex and I will argue that identity first language is the preferred terminology. According to Dunn and Andrews, 76% of study participants with vision impairments said they prefer identity first language. And also, the National Federation of the Blind uses identity first language because they believe person first language is just the politically correct way to talk. State government employees were asked, and 60% of them responded that they preferred person first language. However, 26% also said that disabled person was equivalent, which can be argued as identity first language. And according to a survey conducted on language preference that included 11,212 participants. Out of those, 7,491 of them being autistic people. 76% of autistic respondents and 49% of non-autistic parents prefer identity first language. Only 3.9% of autistic people and 70% of non-autistic parents prefer person first language. Also, according to the BACB Ethics Code, we should continue to maintain our competence in education with changing literature. And so with this study showing us the preferences between person first language and identity first language shows us that the preference is identity first language.
Thank you for that, Margaret. In regards to identity, person first language highlights how anyone is a human before they are their diagnosis, in which they are more than a person who just has autism. Said well by Botha is that stating the person before the disability emphasizes a combo of strength, needs, and experiences. And according to Smith from the University of North Carolina, it was found that parents of children with autism do prefer that person first language is to be used when addressing their child. Person first language we use to put the person before the disability to emphasize the person's unique combinations of strength, needs, and experiences, both related and unrelated to their disability, by literally placing the person before the disability. The BACB code also stands on this, as in Code 5.01, it states that protecting the rights of the clients includes that the behavior analyst takes appropriate steps to protect the rights of their clients in public statements and prioritize the rights of their clients. So when discussing or making statements about the clients, we should be addressing them by their preference. So although having the autism diagnosis is part of one's identity, that is not all they are. By using person-first language, we are reducing the stigma of having the diagnosis and instead focusing on their unique qualities rather than solely on the autism. So we want to promote that individuality. And then in this visual, this states how you can use person-first language outside of just autism. So, for example, instead of saying someone is an alcoholic, you could say that they're living with an alcohol use challenge or disorder. Or instead of saying someone is crazy or insane, you could say that they are a person living with a mental health challenge or trauma. Using identity first language focuses less on the individual and puts more emphasis on their diagnosis. Alex, what do you think about this?
Thank you, Tatum. You're right. It is important to acknowledge a person's strengths and their experiences. It's also important to accept that individual as a whole, and that's including their diagnosis. Using identity first language promotes a sense of identity. Having autism is a part of who these people are, and it should be our main focus to make them feel empowered to embrace this as one of their strengths. Dunn and Andrews mentions that identity first language promotes autonomy, agency, and choice over one's destiny. They also mention a quote from a psychologist colleague of theirs that says, "I am absolutely not a person with autism." And that quote is coming straight from an autistic person themselves. With the code for behavior analysts, it outlines 4 core principles to abide by, one of which is treating others with compassion, dignity, and respect. With this core principle, behavior analysts are obligated to treat others equitably, regardless of their personal identity, including their race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, and disability. These are what make a person unique, and they are a part of who they are. We would argue that identity first language is seen as an expression of positive self identity, according to Botham, and it's redeployed as a form of. Our goal is to empower these individuals and promote a sense of that positive identity, and this includes recognizing and accepting their diagnosis as a part of who they are. Grant, according to Dunn and Andrews, using person-first language might suggest that there's something negative about having a disability, and it dissociates the disability from the person. What is your response to that?
Well, Alex, I agree that we should be empowering those that have disabilities. That's definitely a good thing. I argue that it's not wrong to have a disability, and many people with disabilities have benefited our lives as practitioners. Some, such as Albert Einstein and Temple Grandin, have gone on to do great things. However, it's still an impairment, and the DSM-5, for example, even lists factors related to poor social skills as a defining feature of autism. In addition to that, there are a number of health concerns, and in some cases, severe health concern or health effects related to autism. Individuals with ASD, for example, have an average life expectancy that is at least 20 years shorter than average. I think that's quite a significant thing. And we should not objectify people by focusing on their impairment, but rather embrace them holistically. Social deficits are some of the key defining features of ASD, and identity first language emphasizes these deficits when we should be focusing on the individual holistically. What do you think of that, Margaret?
Well, Grant, I feel like a disability is not an impairment, but rather part of the body. And according to our research, disability is not a state of bodily impairment. individuals should claim the disability and have a sense of pride added to their identity. That's according to Dunn and Andrews. Some adults see autism as a difference and not necessarily a deficit. According to Dunn and Andrews, they discuss the minority model or the diversity model, which portrays disability as neutral or positive, and it asserts that a disability is a natural characteristic or human attribute and not a problem that needs to be fixed.
Okay. We've heard a lot of information during this debate. The end goal was to educate everyone about what terminology to use when we talk to or about autistic people. It's so important that we take all the information we heard today and continue to expand our research in the direction of identity-first language. During this debate, we've heard both sides talk about preferences, identity, and impairment. Margaret and I have argued in favor of identity-first language because disabled people have shown preferences towards identity-first language. It's also important to ensure we are respectful and encouraging towards a sense of identity. We want to promote their autonomy and accept them as a whole. Identity-first language encourages autistic people to claim their disability as it is a part of them and not an impairment.
I apologize. According to Botha, as research on this topic continues to expand, the focus should still shift to the needs, wishes, and experiences of autistic people themselves. There is not enough evidence to accurately depict the preferred language of all autistic people, but according to Botha, he recommends psychologists use both identity-first and person-first language when working with people with disabilities.
To reiterate Grant and I's side, we believe that it can be perceived as derogatory when a person on the spectrum is referred to by their diagnosis. Additionally, most Americans on the spectrum do prefer to be referred to by using person-first language. Person-first language emphasizes that a person's humanity is more important than their diagnosis, and using identity-first language emphasizes a person's diagnosis rather than their individuality. So, although some may argue that using identity-first language is a way to embrace and destigmatize autism, it is a disability, and a wide body of research documents a link between autism and a variety of social, emotional, and physical challenges.
As ABA practitioners, we should acknowledge that autism spectrum disorder is a disability and that our services as practitioners are meant to help individuals on the spectrum blossom into the best versions of themselves while addressing that ASD poses challenges. As I stated earlier, if a person's language preferences are unknown, we should use person-first language. This language emphasizes the humanity, individuality, and contribution to diversity rather than their impediment. It's important that we treat people with dignity by using their preferred language, and if that language is unknown, we should do as the ethics code says and show them dignity by embracing them as a person instead of addressing them by their deficits.
Thank you, participants, for your comments. So now we are going to move on to the question portion. And so now we will ask some questions from the audience. So this first question is for Tatum. And Tatum, Does the way we address people on the autism spectrum heavily impact the future of the ABA or autism community?
Thank you for that, Margaret. Absolutely. I think the way we speak matters. If we are putting people who have autism in a different group solely based on their diagnosis, that will change the perception of how people view them and therefore treat them. The ABA world does not have the best history ethically of treating clients with dignity and respect, so therefore, the way we talk about them, treat them, and interact with the individuals on the spectrum immensely impact their well being.
All right, thank you for that answer, Tatum. The second question is going to be for Alex. And Alex, what do you think is the biggest downside to the form of language that you are arguing for?
Thank you, Margaret, for that question. I think the biggest downside to using identity first language is that it's still an evolving topic. We've discussed how person first language was the original language, but as time goes on, researchers are finding more preference towards identity first language. Because there is not enough research to fully understand all aspects of identity first language and the effects that it has on autistic people, there may be some resistance to accepting it as the new primary language. Does not mean that we should just disregard it. We need to continue research and continue expanding our knowledge on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer, Alex. Question number 3 will be for Grant. And Grant, should we be using the same terminology for all conditions? For example, a person with diabetes as opposed to a diabetic person.
No, the same language should not be used for all conditions. I say this because perception matters, and the connotation that some terms have is perceived as more or less appropriate depending on the term. For example, using identity first language to refer to someone that is blind, such as saying a blind person, is interpreted as benign compared to calling someone with cancer a cancerous person. There are a variety of different conditions, and in the English language, different phrases and variations of phrases have different contexts and are perceived differently. Now, I have a question for you, Margaret. It is easy to get into a habit of speaking regarding person first language versus identity first language. Is there one right way to address individuals? Are we able to use both person first and identity first language in regard to written study?
Thank you for that question, Grant. Based on the research that we have done to cover this debate, first of all, it is probably easy to get into a habit of speaking one way or another because we all have our different professions that we work in, and then we all have our different styles of study that we're in. As far as is there any right way to address individuals, I feel like after doing this research, there's still a lot of research to be done. So I feel like there is not one right way, but I also feel like we should use preferred language with individuals. We should be accommodating. Um, as far as using both person first and identity first in written study, I also feel like it depends on who you're doing your study with, what the teaching style is. Thank you. Also, thank you for attending our debate this evening. Myself, Grant, Tatum, and Alex all thank you for attending and watching our debate. Have a good night. Thank you.